So last week we looked at who Rachel Held Evans was, and we noted that her death really did rock the Christian blogosphere and progressive Christian world because she was at such a young age so vital and so specific in her faith journey of wrestling with questions and having a capacity to put in words, posts, and books, things that were percolating in her heart that led her to embrace a new understanding of faith, of life, of God, of community, all of those things. And she had really resonated with a wide audience. So it was stunning when the world got the news that she was in a coma and would eventually die. So many of the pieces of the book were already done. And so her husband then, of course, reached out to another friend and author to have him complete the work, Jeff Chu. And so this is a posthumous book. It's really a memoir of sorts. She calls herself a memoirist, where she, especially in the first couple of chapters today, she's going to tell us a little bit about her life in Birmingham and then in Dayton, Tennessee. I loved that two things. She said that she was such a zealot for the Lord in witnessing that when she was riding around on her bicycle in her East Birmingham neighborhood, the neighbors would draw the blinds. And then when she gets to Dayton, Tennessee, she discovers that because of all of the churches, there's no one to convert. Everyone was converted. So these chapters today, the 6 chapters that were to have read today, really do kind of unpack this journey from certainty to holy ambiguity. That's Annie Dillard's term. And she's going to talk about holy danger, holy exploration, holy curiosity, and holy attentiveness. What a quartet of holies. Holy danger, holy exploration, holy curiosity, and holy attentiveness. What was her home life like growing up? It kind of defies, doesn't it, the typical fundamentalist home in that it was one of significant grace. And her parents, at least according to the one who would know, did not tamp down questions. But encouraged it and seemed to indicate that she could do whatever she wanted to do. She didn't have to just be, a Sunday school teacher or aim high pastor's wife. So that's what she says in the book. And so her home life was a little bit different. What struck you about her mom and dad? Is there anything she writes that sort of makes them real and cool for you?
Yeah, I loved reading her words. And just as an aside, the first time I heard of Rachel Held Evans was when I went to the Why Christian conference at Duke University, which was 20, I don't know when, 17, 18, I don't know. And I went to hear Nadia Bolz-Weber, whose words resonate with me more than all because there's so much scripture quoted from Rachel Held Evans. And then I went to a breakout session with Jeff Chu, who I really resonated with. So it has been fun for me to read this. But when she says, my church told me a woman's place was in the home, but in my home, my dad told me I could be anything I wanted to be. And my Christian book said, following my heart would only lead me astray. You know, she's like so proud when she says her sinner quoted phrase in front of the church, whatever
Mhm.
that means.
Mhm.
My mom told me to listen to my gut. For a kid, parental courage is remarkably contagious.
Yes.
And I get that. And yeah, she's very fortunate. She just
Yeah.
doesn't have, she, you know, it's just such a dichotomy to me that she's brought up in what always sounded to me like really strict or regimented or, you know, a sort of handbook of how to be. But within her home, she's given all the tools she needs to be a you know, fully thinking adult for herself.
Right. Yeah. I like how she basically says the faith of home and church that had to, in many ways, be deconstructed was ultimately saved by what her parents gave her. That the grace and the intellectual and spiritual curiosity, which they embodied, apparently, even if they didn't have, even if they don't share the same views that she ultimately landed at, they gave her that space, and that is a significant piece to her story. It really does defy the general stereotypical, I grew up in a fundamentalist home, I was raised with ultimate, ultra white wing, right wing Christianity. And then I broke free of that. My parents don't speak to me, and da 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 da. That's not her story. Her story is a different one. And you really get the sense that she very much loved her parents.
Isn't that interesting how that controlling, when people raise their children with a strong arm of control,
Yeah.
and people tend to maybe leave their faith or have a rocky relationship with their parents, whereas Rachel was given freedom to question and navigate, and then she had a very authentic faith. She had a deep faith
Right.
because of those roots. Cool.
Yeah. So holy exploration. So we know a little bit about what her life in Birmingham and Dayton looked like. Then she goes off to college, and at college she has kind of a two-pronged stage. One was, I'll be even more devout than my parents. I loved how she put it, I will rebel by becoming to the right of them. And that does not last very long, because ultimately in that environment of questions, even when it is seemingly controlled, questions are just going to pop out when you're in a learning environment. You know, liberals can be produced at places like Bob Jones. You know that, right? And Liberty University can produce progressives. Not by intention, but it just happens because people have questions, and that holy exploration leads to searching out different answers. And so let me, before I forget it, let me just say this. Rachel Held Evans did not wake up one day and say, I want to deconstruct my faith. That's not what happened. Life happened. And that's really when anyone begins poking around the edges of things in a life experience, an event, a death, a broken relationship, a joyous thing, when anything happens that really captures your mind and heart, and you are beginning to think about it critically for the very first time, that's when, rather than a slippery slope into relativism, it is a pathway and a door opening for the divine. If you look at it more like this is an opportunity of growth rather than uh, and I know all of you do, but in some quarters, that is really taboo. You just don't do it. Fortunately for her, that's not what her home life said, even though maybe her college experience did say that, which led her to ask even more questions. Didn't you love the little scene where she's with the professor and she's got this question and he says, God's ways are not our ways. Shut up. And she keeps pressing. And as Dele pointed out last week, the question that ultimately sent her to the edge was, what do we do about Anne Frank? What happens to Anne Frank? You know, Anne Frank has probably been more responsible for Christians moving into universalism than any other person in the history of the world. And I don't mean to make light of her, that. I'm just saying that question, and Gandhi, and Thich Nhat Hanh, who just died this week. So many of these great thinkers and people who love God, and you discover that there are ultimately so many pathways to God. When Jesus says the Shema, when he quotes the Shema, you shall love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. That's the command of love, God, neighbor, as you love yourself. And we'll unpack that more in a bit. But that's the question that ultimately sends her down a different path. And other questions are going to emerge, other doubts, other uncertainties are going to populate her system, not just her belief system, but every pore in her is going to be bathed in holy curiosity. It's kind of beautiful. It's not kind of, it is beautiful to see it play out in such a funny and humorous and winsome kind of way. So back to that question though, what was it for you? Or is it for you? The question, we kind of explored this last week, that made you really reassess or even interrogate your belief system, that sent you perhaps on a different path. Most of us, I think, on this call were not raised in a hyper fundamentalist setting, I don't think. I know Kristen wasn't, I know Ashley wasn't. Yeah, okay, yeah. But of course, conservative fundamentalists, evangelicals, are not the only ones that need to deconstruct, right? That progressives also have some things that we need to deconstruct at times, often, because she makes the wonderful point that when she looked at the citadel, she calls it the citadel of her faith, the fortress, she sometimes worried and wondered if she had not left behind aspects of her fundamentalism. She just raised a different flag. I thought that was a really insightful point of her own critical look at her own new orientation. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Fundamentalists can be, liberals can be just as rigid as fundamentalists in a different way, and absolute in a different way, certain in a different way. So that's something you have to, be open to learning and thinking about yourself. I want to point you to a couple of passages in the book right quick. Go to My Wicked Little Heart. This begins on page 25. That scripture she read in her Alabama accent was Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful. Can't you hear her saying that? Above all things, and desperately wicked. Not just wicked, desperately wicked. Who can know it? She went to Awana. And my first thought was royal ambassadors. I was an RA. Were any of you GAs? Y'all didn't grow up. So Jessica, of course, Jessica was a GA.
I didn't know what Awana stood for. I learned that. That was funny.
Yes, I didn't know what it stood for either. Page 31. I desperately wanted them to label me a Jesus freak. I very much wanted them to hear, find, and see that Jesus Christ was my loud and beating heart. And guess what? We do. we end up thinking that, maybe not as she had intended it. As she matures, she discovers that she was privileged. And on page 32, she talks about how those who had, top of 32, they had to hide their sexuality. They smiled through racist slurs. They minimized their doubts. They kept quiet about their abuse. At my high school in Tennessee, memorizing Bible verses wouldn't get you labeled a weirdo, but being gay might. And if you were a girl, dressing like a stereotypical boy might. Now I regret that I didn't understand any of this at the time. So convinced God lived in the boxes I'd constructed, I failed to look for God in God's favorite place, the margins. The thing about being all in, and I call it the Christian package, is that it's a hard fall when the foundation gives way. I have an amen corner here. I don't know why the neighbor thinks he can walk in his yard. I don't know why.
Is that Ollie? His bark sounds way bigger than such.
That's true on so many levels. 35, we're going to have Ashley pronounce the German word for us. Zerrissenheit.
Zerrissenheit?
Zerrissenheit.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm
We can hear you.
You're
Zerrissenheit.
Yes, yes.
Zerrissenheit.
Yes. And what I loved her description of this and William James's translation, torn to pieces hood. It refers to the sense of fragmentation, disjointedness we experience whenever we operate out of fear and shame. So she's wrestling. She's understood her privilege, but now she begins to turn. She looks at the folks at the margins, and she ultimately gets to the point to say, that's where God is, not in my regimen, not in my nicely constructed box, but out there. And I have had to now see that I can't be a Christian with half my heart, half my soul, half my mind, half my body. I want all in. I want a wholehearted faith. At the bottom of 35, systems that teach people to disengage do not produce healthy individuals, nor do they foster healthy communities. The rest of this chapter, she talks about all of the questions that make her move from her evangelical world ultimately to the Episcopal Church. And we'll say more about that in the weeks to come. Page 38, faith is best held with an open hand, nurtured by both boundaries and improvisation, tradition and innovation. And then at the bottom of 38, that's where we're going to come to her most specific way she understands wholeheartedness. Kristen, would you read for us that final paragraph on page 38 that bleeds over into 39?
Starting with yet even.
Yeah.
Yet even before I could put these words to these ideas, my parents created an environment in which wholehearted faith was never at odds with questioning or with uncertainty. Wholeheartedness means that we can be doubtful and still find rest in the tender embrace of a God who isn't threatened by human inconsistency. Wholeheartedness means that we can ask bold questions, knowing that God loves us, not just in spite of them, but also because of them, and because of the searching, seeking spirits that inspire us to want to know God more deeply. Wholeheartedness means that we can approach the throne of grace in the confidence that who made us, the God who redeemed us, and the God who accompanies us.
Last week, Jessica said that when we were trying to think about, so where does wholeheartedness begin? And we said that it finds itself in the acceptance of our own authenticity, our own self, that we can bring the entirety of who we are to God. And the final chapter in today's class is around the Jonathan Edwards idea of your sinful nature, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, better described as God in the hands of angry sinners. If you start with love and blessing and inculcate in your children that they are loved beyond all else, that before, she said this last week, that before you do anything right, before you do anything wrong, before you do anything, you are blessed and you are loved infinitely by God. So with that as the foundation of a life of faith, if you can be authentically you and unafraid and confident, as she points out here in page at the end of 38, you are on the path to wholeheartedness, and it's not that it's a destination, but it's okay with look at all of the ways she unpacks this. Doubts are okay, bold questions are okay, searching, seeking spirits okay. And this is accompanied by a God who creates, who redeems, and who accompanies us. That's a Trinitarian formula of Creator, Christ, and Spirit. But authenticity, vulnerability, and curiosity, exploration, not the sin of certainty. This is what we all, I think, this is what we all hope for ourselves and hope for our children and hope for others' children. Maybe the issue is that for some people, they think if it isn't rigid, it isn't Christian. That if it isn't exclusive, it isn't Christian. If it's not us versus them, it isn't Christian. And that's why when people first discover, in some cases, they discover Binkley or a Binkley-like church, it's disorienting. If you come from that background and then you step into our doors and it's so different, it can be disorienting to you and you question whether or not it's Christian. So to that, we say, what? To the person who stood in line with Charles Coble at Harris Teeter, and when the lady behind him found out that he was buying something to take over to his church right next door, she said, "You don't go to that church, do you?" And then she described it in ways that are not appropriate for our conversation. I mean, so that's the response, and that might have been to some degree the response of someone like Rachel Held Evans, that it is just too much. The next chapter, she introduces us to Brene Brown, although I know you've been introduced to her. By the way, Brene Brown, Michael Dell, and myself were all at UT Austin at the same time. Who's most famous?
Matthew McConaughey.
That's right. And this is a beautiful passage from page 42 of the Rabbi. There's nothing as whole as a broken heart. In these traditions, you cultivate a broken heart, which is very different from depression or sadness. It's the kind of vulnerability, openness, and acute sensitivity to your own suffering and the suffering of others that becomes an opportunity for connection. So wholeheartedness is yet another sign of brokenheartedness, is another sign of wholeheartedness. A compassionate response to your own suffering, but also to the suffering of others. And then she basically takes Brene Brown's wholehearted living, which she describes in The Gift of Imperfection. I am imperfect, vulnerable, sometimes afraid, but that doesn't change the truth that I am also brave and worthy of love and belonging. This is going to prove to be really important for Rachel Held Evans, because she will pick up on Brene Brown's work on guilt and shame, and she will ask the important questions about, do faith communities foster out of fear, shame, and toxic guilt, or do they nurture and create space for grace and blessing? Which doesn't mean that everything goes, it means something else. And so that work, Brown's work on shame and guilt, will be very important for her. This chapter, I think, really, page 45, I really liked. I have come to believe that wholehearted faith, like all wholehearted living, requires taking risks, cultivating vulnerability, embracing uncertainty, both in our individual lives and in our communal life together. It demands that we admit all that we cannot know, and it encourages us to pursue it nonetheless. So when do you give up the know-it-all syndrome? When do you give that up? What has to happen for you to give up the know-it-all-ness?
Know-it-allness about what?
About anything.
Everything?
And anything and everything. Is it okay? It is okay to say, I just don't know. And we often don't say, I don't know, because we think we have to know. And if we don't know, we'll just bullshit our way through an answer. Well, most people have a good BS detector. And so they know what, I don't know. It's okay to just say that. Yes, Dele, with the hand in Paris.
No, I was just gonna comment. Yeah, I think it's just such a barrier to entry. Christianity or faith in general. It's like this idea that there's an answer for everything. And then and hearkening to like what she mentions before, like,
Right.
you know, it's just like it either like keeps you trapped or like just doesn't allow you to like dig in any further. So just the notion that like there's not a complete answer seems so simple, but like it's such a hard thing to master. And to your first, and like go back to your question about like the lady that said something to Charles Coble.
Yeah.
I mean, like my reaction to, yeah, I suppose that the response should be a compassionate one, but honestly, like my reaction to someone that's always just like, oh, you go to that church or you have a view of Christianity that's more progressive. Honestly, like my first thoughts was just like, you're making us look bad. Like you're messing it up for the rest of us. Like your fundamental, by the book, non-inclusive thing has given us, and by us I mean just Christians in general, a bad light. Like that's that's my first response. But it's, you know, I'm supposed to be like, you know, that I'm supposed to say something a little bit more diplomatic, I suppose. But you know, it's really like it's really hard. So I appreciate her writings because it's at least there are other people out there who are kind of struggling with the same deal.
I think Dele just revealed his desperately little wicked heart, didn't he?
Pastor Marcus knows this, but it's so I'm in HR and like, well, currently the vaccine mandates are on hold, but like I'm a part of a group of people that have been reviewing exemption requests for the vaccine mandates, and like you can choose for religious or medical ones. So I've been like reading these like religious ones, and so like it's really hard to like separate like my own,
Yes,
obviously like personal faith beliefs, and then reading others that are like really like kind of what she references in the book, like people that are cut from the same cloth that are kind of like spouting these things. But yeah, it's a daily exercise. What do I say to these people? We don't have to talk about like whether I approve them or not. That's neither here nor there. It's kind of on hold, so there's nothing to approve. But yeah, I think that's really, in general, I think that's just really hard to kind of spread that message of like inclusiveness to one where like the brand is not, that's not the brand that's out there.
Well, your comment about you make that sometimes their responses and their behaviors make it harder for the rest of us. On 52 and 53, she basically says, why not put on and display and demonstrate an openness, because most people are not really drawn to becoming a know-it-all. 53, most are not looking for a bulletproof, open-hearted wanderers are not looking for a bulletproof belief system, but a community of friends, not for a spiritual encyclopedia that contains every answer, but for a gathering of loved ones in which they can ask hard questions. And the questions don't always have to have answers. Rilke's wisdom of, you know, live the questions and hold them with an open hand. So the Shema, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. She quotes Amy Jill Levine, though this is on 57, who I love saying this. Amy Jill Levine, a Jewish scholar who teaches New Testament at Vanderbilt has this. She reminds us that the heart represents the center of thought, intellect, emotions, and conviction. So that it's not just the feeling center. It's all of that. There's no dichotomy in that. There's no you've got a mind and then you have a heart. No, it's all of one. It's whole. So wholehearted. And she links that up with hesed, or loving kindness, kind love. This is on 61. She reminds us that there's a second prayer along with the Shema called the Ahava Olam. And that is what she defines as big love. This is 61. Deep love, abundant, overwhelming, sweep you off your feet, knocking you over with love. Because that's the kind of love that God had for our ancestors and had for us. But we're so often too busy to even notice. So notice, the prayer says, notice that you are surrounded by, infused with, and kept in life by love. God's love, that beating heart of the universe. That's nice. So that is that precedes the Shema, and she concludes that chapter with reminding us that it was Jesus who quoted the Shema, not a system. There's no four spiritual laws in any of his answers. It's love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. And so the last chapter, the 6th chapter. So let's ask this, let's ask some questions about theology for a second. Why do people lead with sin? Why do some churches and some ministers, a lot of people, why do we lead with sin?
I have no idea.
Why do you suppose?
Because we all know it.
Yeah. And of course, we have to get a definition, right? And for a lot of people, the definitions become problematic. So is that my nature? Is it my nature to rebel, to make mistakes, to deliberately and intentionally hurt people? Do the stories of my tradition give example after example of that? Is that why we turn there? What is appealing about leading with sin? Ashley?
Because we're also filled with fear of others, of ourselves. And sin is so much about, what we name sin is so much about fear of ourselves and others.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it. And imagine being not just steeped in that, but bathed over and over, year after year, decade after decade, with that.
Well, I mean, imagine how different the Bible would be if in that first story, when God makes Adam came into consciousness and said, I am afraid. And if God had said, that's all right, it would have been a completely different story.
Right. Yeah, Jessica?
Also, I'm thinking about this. I also think that to base your whole spirituality around sin and worthiness. It also gives you an out. And I really appreciated in this chapter how she talked about to be worthy of God's love simply by existing. And if you have this theology or spirituality where you leverage who deserves grace, who deserves love, who deserves compassion and deserves God, then you get to pick and choose who you love and so forth. And so a church like Binkley, where all are welcome and all are deserving of love, that's hard work. That's hard. And you have to dismantle a lot of systems, and you have to then do lifelong work of thinking about things like oppression and all the isms, you know. And for a church to say, well, we're focused on sin and we're focused on this small view of that, then you get a big out, and ultimately you really lose God in that, you know. And so I'm thinking about that too. It's easy. It's those prefabricated answers that she talks about. They're not fulfilling.
Yeah, beautifully stated and right on the money. So back to the Brene Brown impact on Held Evans. This is page 74. When she talks about Brown's research, she says that we are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to love, to be loved, and to belong. What if that was the lead? The one thing that people who had a sense of worthiness was the belief in their worthiness. If we want to fully experience love and belonging, we must believe that we are worthy of love and belonging. In fact, Brown defines wholehearted living as a way of engaging with the world from a place of worthiness. So when that is foremost, when that leads the conversation, that's a different thing. I had a wonderful conversation with Elizabeth Thompson maybe a month or so ago when she was describing an experience her daughter was having at Wake Forest. And apparently Sarah had encountered some FCA people or Young Life people or something, and they couldn't believe that she was that she did not share the positions that they had on. I can't even remember what the topic was, but Sarah had such a different posture as it related to all of this, because she had been steeped in holy curiosity, holy attentiveness, holy curiosity, and she just didn't have that posture, which was not fear-based or exclusive-based. It was an inclusive love base. And that will put you at that odds with some of your just not just classmates, but for a lot of people in the world. Page 75, right quick. She draws the distinction between shame and guilt, noting guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. For people of faith, and especially for Christians, this research raises some important questions. Does any claim to our inherent worthiness contradict religious teaching and the witness of our sacred texts? Yes. Can we deal honestly with our sins without internalizing shame? Yes. Does our belief system require that we see ourselves as nothing more than loathsome insects, deserving only to be swept by tsunami waves into the fires of hell? Or can we too engage the world from a place of worthiness.
I'm still not sure I understand it. So on
Okay.
page 65, let's just imagine that our kids are in Sunday school. God hates you. God is disgusted by you. God thinks no more of you than you might think of a pesky insect crushed under your boot. It is a compelling message. So, like Marcus, as a pastor, is it to, if you came across with that and you're raising your kids to believe that, is it for sort of control and good behavior and to keep my flock together? I mean, I'm just really trying to get my head into the leadership of the church, why you do that. When
Yeah.
Ashley was talking about fear, I would be petrified. Yes. Would I do better works maybe and just behave better and give more? And is that the point, do you think, or anybody?
Yeah, what do others?
I mean,
Yeah, just that description, it takes your breath away, doesn't it?
it does.
Yeah,
It does.
it just, it is so unfathomable to me that that would be what someone does. Because I've never really been in a situation, I've certainly never pastored a church that had that as its center. But I mean, I haven't been in that environment. But I've seen it and I've heard of people, of course, express it. And I think, you know, biblical inerrancy and the merger and marriage of right-wing culture war warriors has led to this devaluation of the inherent goodness and worthiness of individuals. The growing edge for us, and you know, it's really not learning if you don't also try to take it to where you need to grow. The growing edge for, speak for me. What do we do with those folks who really aren't getting not just the vaccine, but getting the reasons and the science behind the need for the vaccine? My growing edge is again, it doesn't mean that you have to agree, but it does mean that we don't get off the hook to love. And
That's really hard.
it is. It is.
I saw Jessica's comment and I hear that. And in the process of reading this too, I thought it took Rachel Held Evans a while to figure out that there were margins just by virtue of how she grew up. And she was in this homogenous town. And, you know, it made me think about, when do we learn about margins in our lives? You know, are we born into that? Some of us, do we, you know, when do you figure out, you don't always figure it out, but when you start to figure that out, and that shapes who we are in our faith too.
That's a
She had a lot of learning to do from other teachers. It's why she gravitated to Nadia. It's why she, you know, and she has made really important work out of it.
yes.
Lots of us.
That is so good. And yeah, I loved your question. How do we learn for not just who are at them, what are the margins? And
Find something in ourselves that is marginal.
yes.
I feel like sometimes in church, it is still about us and them.
Yeah.
And I am so marginal in many ways, you know, like embrace that. I feel worthy. I love those parts of me. And there's so much imperfection. And so when we help people, we're just helping ourselves, I think, a lot of the time.
Boy, I agree with all of that, and resonate with, more than agree, I resonate with that. On 75 at the where you quoted, many of us have been talked out of that hope by a parent a Sunday school teacher, a pastor, or maybe even our own fragile selves. In some way or another, many of us have become convinced that we will never be worthy of love because of our sin, because of our humanity, and because of something that happened in a mysterious garden a long time ago. Still, I think deep in their hearts, most people want to believe that they are somehow worthy of love and belonging, that their worst day of suffering or their best day of wholeheartedness is not better than they deserve. I think most people yearn for a God who not merely tolerates, but also adores God's creation. I think most people still long for a God who kneels down. And communities that try to embody that and incarnate that. Imperfectly, to be sure, but nonetheless does that. So the rest of the book are essays that tries to explore more of wholeheartedness, authenticity, and as well as some timely topics. So what I'd like for us to do next week is there are 8 of these essays. They're each about 12 to 15 pages, so not very long at all. Find your favorite in the reading, and bring to us why it was why it became memorable or important to you. What does she say in one of these essays that really packs a punch for you? That's how we'll finish the book. Other thoughts, other things that she says that you just really, in these chapters, that you want to comment on? Anybody?
I would just say that Marcus, you described kind of a disorientation for people who are brought up in a tradition and then come experience Binkley. And I just would give a testimony that it happens in reverse too, that you can go to Binkley and then befriend people or take part in worship or find another church community that it comes from a very different place, and it's equally disorienting. But for me, it's been important to have both of those experiences and both bring up questions. It just, for me, happened in reverse.
Yes. Yeah. No, yeah.
I make sure I understand that. Do you mean, Kristen, like if you're brought up in Binkley and then you might move to a different church, or I'm missing that?
Yeah, brought up in Binkley, and you know, I went to FCA and Young Life in high school, and that was a very different
Right.
perspective than what I was being taught in Sunday school. And I went to a Franklin Graham crusade, and I went to other churches, like when I lived different places, and I thought, you know, I'm at Binkley and I understand where Binkley is coming from, but it was still important to me as part of my journey to kind of understand maybe that different place or that different teaching and what questions, and I don't have answers, but I think it's brought up important questions that I wouldn't have encountered if I hadn't had those experiences and had just been at Binkley. And that was, you know, my only exposure to faithful teachings.
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
I think we have named Kate Bowler before, Bowler. Kate teaches at Duke Divinity School, and she she has her newest book is No Cure for Being Human. I love that time. But her first book was Everything Happens for Reasons and Other Lies That They Taught Us. And so for her PhD, she goes into faith healing communities and prosperity gospel communities to get to know the principles and the theology and the practices. Well, guess what? She falls in love with these people. She doesn't agree with them. She does not in any way, shape, or form condone or even come near legitimizing the truth of that, but she loves them. And when she has to break the news to them that she has cancer, it completely shifts for them what? Health is the blessing and illness is the sign of something else. And those relationships were able to hold because of friendship, and an affection that transcended belief. I read all of that as hopeful, and I give her tons of credit for sticking with these friendships through all of that. I really recommend the book No Cure for Being Human. It's very good. It's one of those books that really helps you appreciate just what it means to be fully human, and that fully human is not so far away from divine. It's really a good thing. And if you think fully human is more sinful than blessed, this will stretch you. Other thoughts before we go? I've got to get dressed and go to church. Oh, I'm sorry. We taped the service this week because, you know, we were promised 36 feet of snow. I do believe that Don Schwinneker gets a cut from Harris Teeter. That's right. James Forbes is our preacher today. It's magnificent. You'll love it. It's a sermon, by the way, that looks at, do we too easily go to playing the victim? Do we go there too quick? And do we stay there unnecessarily? When, you know, one of the things that she says in the book was she understood, ultimately she had to get to the idea of, I have had privilege. And when that privilege is no longer privilege, I can treat it as persecution when all it really is I've just had my privilege exposed. Well, Forbes is going to ask the question, did the man sitting at the pool of Bethsaida, did he play the victim so long, 38 years, did he play it so long that he had no other way to understand himself? It's a good sermon. So I recommend him and today's service to you. All right. Next week, you know what you got to do. Find a chapter, an essay that you really liked. All right. Thank you guys very much. Ollie says bye. Ollie says bye. Say bye.
Aw.
Bye, Ollie.
Bye, Ollie.
Jessica's cat. I don't know who that is, but
I'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.